Yeah, so I study primarily physical process and form in rivers, but those physical processes interact a lot with biota, whether it's hippos in the southern hemisphere or beaver, deadwood, living riparian vegetation. There's a lot of different versions of this. And the title of the talk reflects the fact that there were a lot more beaver pretty much everywhere in the continental United States historically, certainly in Colorado. And if you read some of the earliest written descriptions, by the time Fremont came through in 1842, he talks about seeing lots of abandoned beaver lodges and dams, and it was a big deal when they saw a colony that was still active. So between when Lewis and Clark went through the West and when Fremont came through less than 40 years later, there was widespread loss of beaver populations. Of course, that was the commercial fur trade. And I've got the future part in there because, as Nate alluded to, they are returning somewhat. We're never going to go back to historical levels because we're all here and many of us are living in their former habitat. But we have a long way that we can go in terms of restoring beaver populations and beaver effects. So, if I can do this. So I figure out how to work the laptop, we will proceed. There we go. I got it. It's the page down. I think it's important to put this in context that rivers throughout the temperate latitudes, I said the northern hemisphere because that's where it's historically been more industrialization and intensive agriculture, but rivers throughout the northern hemisphere, temperate latitudes, have been dramatically changed in the last century to 2 centuries. And the short version of that is they've been simplified and they've been homogenized. So they've become mostly single channels rather than branching channels that wander across the valley floor before rejoining downstream. They've been homogenized and, fortunately it doesn't look like this anymore, but that's the Poudre as it used to look just east of I-25. It was channelized in the 1960s. They put up artificial levees. There's now been a big restoration project there, and it looks very different. But a lot of rivers still look like this throughout the continental United States. And if you can see that photo on the lower right, that's what a lot of rivers look like when we haven't channelized and homogenized and simplified them. That's the Yukon River in the central part of Alaska, a place called Yukon Flats Wildlife Refuge. So a variety of things that people have done. We've regulated flow, we've stabilized the banks, we've made the rivers straighter, simpler, we've put artificial levees on them, we've taken out naturally occurring obstructions like log jams and beaver dams. So the net effect has been to make them simpler. One way to think about this is to use a more technical phrase, loss of spatial heterogeneity. And I sometimes refer to that as messiness in rivers. Spatial heterogeneity refers to patches. So if I walked into this room and I was a Martian anthropologist, I could say, oh, there's things going on here. And each person could be a patch because you are a distinct, spatially distinct entity that's different than whoever's sitting next to you or behind you. Landscape ecologists use patches to describe that spatial heterogeneity or messiness in any environment, not just river corridors. And you can distinguish patches on different criteria. In rivers, it's often vegetation, which reflects things like the relative elevation in the floodplain, soil moisture, the history of the river moving back and forth. Natural rivers, if you look at that picture of the Yukon, you can hopefully see some standing water down here and some rapids where these big meander beds have moved back and forth through time. They've created differences in topography, vegetation, soil moisture. As you simplify and homogenize rivers, you lose a lot of that lateral mobility of the channel. You lose natural disturbances of flood. So you go to this simpler and more homogeneous system. And part of the reason we made rivers look like that photo on the lower left is to get things downstream fast. And the things could be stuff on barges, so navigation, could be waste, all the junk we were dumping in the river. It could be floods. We want to get those flood peaks away from our cities and farm fields. So if you make a river straight and simple, everything moves downstream pretty efficiently. And that may be good in some cases, and it may be very bad in other cases. We have water that goes off the landscape really fast, again, as Nate alluded to in the intro, and that's not always what we want. We also have sediment that moves off the landscape really fast. And if you want a recent example, think about Black Hollow. Sediment came out into the Poudre and it moved downstream pretty fast. And it would have done that no matter what, but it moved a little bit faster because of some of the alterations in the Poudre River. Organic matter is just dead plant parts, which can be a very important part of river ecosystems. Nutrients that can be dissolved in the water. In our part of the world, nitrate's a big concern. So all these things move downstream really fast, and that's usually not good in terms of what happens at the downstream end of the system. And in the case of nitrate, I would guess many of you have heard of the big dead zone that forms, or that is always present now in the Gulf of Mexico, and sometimes it goes traveling up the East Coast as far as New Jersey. That's partly because there's so much nitrate coming out of Mississippi, because we've made that river into a very efficient conveyance system. So there are all these secondary effects on water quality, on how many organisms can survive in that river network, the biodiversity of those organisms. So we know that there are a lot of unfortunate secondary effects here. And when I think of rivers, particularly in the mountains, such as the Front Range, I tend to think of them as beads and strings, partly because it's a really simple idea. I didn't come up with this idea. It comes from stream ecologists working in the Northern Rockies. But a Google Earth view of North St. Vrain Creek in Rocky Mountain National Park, the string is the upper part. It's the classic mountain river that you might think of. It's narrowly confined. It's a single channel. It's steep. It's pretty efficient at moving things downstream. The bead that's showing up here is a big beaver meadow. It's the Wild Basin area. So there's a wider valley floor. There's a lot more of that spatial heterogeneity or patchiness. Everything moves down through there much more slowly than it does through a string. So the beads, you can think of them as being more retentive. There's water stored at the surface, in secondary channels, in floodplain ponds and lakes, in the subsurface. There's sediment stored across the floodplain. There's dissolved material that's going into the groundwater or into a shallow zone just below the surface where there's a lot of microbial communities that can take up nitrate. These beads are often much more biologically productive than streams. And that retention reflects that patchiness or that spatial heterogeneity. It's as if, imagine a scenario where I came running through the door and I wanted to get to that corner. If none of you or the chairs were here, I could do it pretty quickly, but I can't do it very quickly because of all the spatial heterogeneity and the roughness that's being created by everybody in this room, all the obstacles. Same thing with water. If it moves through a floodplain that there's lots of different flow paths, there's a lot of vegetation, there's beaver dams or log jams, everything moves more slowly. So one way to think of a river is 3 dimensions of connectivity. And connectivity, as the word implies, is how quickly can material or organisms move between different patches. So longitudinal connectivity in a river is just upstream, downstream. Inanimate material goes downstream, some fish go upstream, and some other organisms like eels. Lateral, between the channel and the floodplain, so across the valley floor. And then vertical, between the surface and the subsurface. So the groundwater and the surface water, or that shallow zone called the hyporheic zone. Because beads store things, they're also better able to withstand disturbances. And I understand later in this series, Emily Fairfax is going to come and talk about beavers and fire. And she's got a great paper called Smokey the Beaver that talks about how beaver meadows are resistant to fire. So even looking at Google Earth, all those dark patches, that's standing water. The water table is at the surface in that floodplain. So it's a very good natural fire break. And it's also a place where organisms that are mobile can go to during the fire as a refugium, and then they can go out and recolonize the landscape after the fire. So fire is one example, but these beads tend to be a little bit better off when there's disturbances. So as an example, I'm just going to zoom in through this. This is in the upper Colorado River Basin. You can see Grand Lake there. This is from Google Earth. The areas that I've outlined in yellow are a little bit different color, and they've got different vegetation. The dark green here is conifer forest. As you keep zooming in, you can see more and more of this. And, you know, I'm guessing everybody in this room goes hiking in the Front Range, so you're familiar with these features. You've seen them. And this is an example of a string, again, on the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park. It's steep, it's narrow, naturally. Things go downstream very efficiently. This is an example of what you were just looking at in Google Earth. It's an old beaver meadow. There's no active beaver dams now, but the effects of the beavers have persisted for decades. And you can see the amount of water storage. You're not looking at the channel there. The channel is at the back of the photo. You can't see it. This is an off-channel pond. So before I go any farther, I just want to have a couple of sort of background things. One is that I'll often say river corridor instead of river. If you say river, most people think of the active channel. End of story. A river corridor is the channel, but it's also the adjacent valley floor that can be inundated during floods, or that the channel can move back and forth across, so the floodplain. And then the term you may not have heard of, hyporeic zone, it's just from the Greek, it means flow below. Hypo is below, reic is flow. This is water that's in the channel. It goes into the subsurface, flows for a little bit, and then returns to the surface. So as opposed to groundwater that can come from outside of the river corridor and come up to the surface, this is surface flow that's going back and forth. It's very important for a couple of reasons. The hyporeic zone is sometimes called the river's liver, although I think it should be called the river's kidney, but that's not as... There's a lot of microbial communities that live in the hyporeic zone, and they do some nice things for everybody else, including us. They take up nitrate, for example, so they can reduce nitrate loads. Going into the subsurface, even for a matter of hours, can also help to keep the water cool, which is very important for salmonids, for our native species, and it's going to become more important as air temperature gets warmer and warmer and we lose some of our snowmelt flow. So that hyporeic zone is important. River corridor, saying it that way, acknowledges that the active channel doesn't just exist floating in space. It's connected to the floodplain and the underlying hyporeic zone. So again, you might think of a river, things are coming in from the valley walls, maybe when it rains or snow melts, and they're moving downstream. But really, it's more like this. There's groundwater coming in and going out. There's this hyporeic exchange. There's things moving downstream. There's things moving back and forth across the floodplain. And things here are water, anything dissolved in the water, sediment, organisms. It is a strongly three-dimensionally connected system if it's a naturally functioning river, as opposed to one that's been modified and simplified. So because those bead portions are wider and they can have more of that patchiness, they tend to have a lot of lateral and vertical connectivity. And again, just saying river corridor helps to remind all of us, including me, of that. Wow, I keep doing the wrong one. No, this is the right one. Okay, so an example of spatial heterogeneity. Again, this is an old beaver meadow in a bead, but hopefully you can see even at the back, see that for sure, but there's scars where this channel has moved back and forth across the floodplain. Even though the channel hasn't been there in decades, it's still leaving differences in elevation, soil moisture, vegetation, and certainly there's going to be hyporeic and groundwater exchange occurring across some of these areas as well. And an example that's a little bit more active, this is near Independence Pass. There is beaver activity there. This is one of the nicer places you can see easily from a road. And you can see it's not just a single channel in a valley floor. There's ponded areas on the channel, off the channel. There's channels that seem to branch off almost like a network of tree roots that don't quite rejoin. Some of them rejoin. They've definitely got subsurface connectivity, and some of them have surface connectivity. So when you look at a river corridor, this is again on the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park, even though it's called East Inlet Creek. I hope that and you can think about it as being connected to the greater landscape. So there's a lot going on. There's exchange between the channel and the floodplain, things coming in from the adjacent uplands, material going back up into the atmosphere. That could be aquatic insects that emerge as winged adults after their larval phase in the stream. It could be things evaporating from the channel, including water. There's things coming in from the atmosphere, some of which are nice, some of which are not so nice. So again, I think the most appropriate way to think about a river channel is in the context of a river corridor and the river corridor in this landscape context. So just to illustrate that idea of resilience a little more, this is Wild Basin on the east side of Rocky Mountain National Park. The view, I'm guessing many of you are familiar with the trail up to Sand Beach Lake. So from the lateral moraine looking down at the top, this is an off-channel beaver pond. On one side of the valley, the active channel is out of the view in the back. And then a place where it's hard to tell here, but there's 3 channels coming together. Again, that's very resilient to drought or fire because there's a lot of water stored in the surface and the subsurface. It's also very resilient to floods. And this is fun to give this talk here because many of you will have vivid memories of this. 2013 flood, remember that? I was working in this beaver meadow at the time, and I was so desperate to get up there. And first we had a government shutdown, so the park was closed, and the roads were all taken out. But when I was able to get up there, I think it was early December, I was kind of shocked because I went to the upstream end of this beaver meadow and I couldn't tell there'd been a flood. And if you remember what happened downstream on North St. Vrain to Lyons and the lower part of the canyon, this photo was taken in early June. The willows are just starting to leaf out. If you want to have a fun challenge, go walk across this beaver meadow at Wild Basin. It's perfectly legal. There's no trails. Wear chest waders and prepare to get wet anyway. It's really hard to get through there. So it's also very resilient to floods. The 2013 flood went through there, but it slowed down so much, there was very little channel change. There was some sediment and some large wood at the upstream end of the beaver meadow, and that's about it. And if you're not familiar with this area, it's right above Route 7. And this may be a picture that Emily Fairfax shows in her talk. We've both shown it. We got it from Joe Wheaton. It's very bleached out, but this is a site that had in Idaho that had a pretty intense wildfire. It's a little hard to tell, but the upper slopes were completely burned and the river corridor stayed green. This was taken immediately after the fire, I think within 2 weeks, because of all the standing water, and that's beaver modified. So the tie between what I've been talking about with spatial heterogeneity and beavers is that beavers tend to create spatial heterogeneity or patchiness in river corridors. And this is the paper that I was referring to. Emily has looked at this at sites throughout the western U.S. and shown really nicely that those beaver dammed areas are much more resistant to fire. So within the beads around here in the mountain streams, there's 2 things that are very important that I sometimes refer to as biotic drivers, but we could just say log jams and beaver dams. That's simpler. So anything that obstructs the flow. If I'm a river and I suddenly come to an obstacle, a log jam across the channel or a beaver dam, I'm going to go off to the sides. Well, first I'm going to slow down and the water's going to get deeper and deeper, and then it's go over the channel banks into the floodplain. And once that happens, particularly during floods, the water can concentrate in secondary paths and start to create these channels that branch and rejoin. In the case of beaver dams, of course, beaver can also dam those secondary channels, and you end up with this very complex spatial mosaic of dams and ponds of differing ages, differing degrees of infill. It's a very patchy environment. So a lot of the forcers for this spatial heterogeneity in our mountain streams, like coniferous forests, they're log jams, and in the wider areas with more sunshine or more solar exposure, where you get things like willows, aspens, alder, river birch, they're likely to be beaver. So beavers get this nice title of ecosystem engineer and keystone species because they modify the environment for themselves, but that creates habitat that otherwise wouldn't be available for a lot of different organisms. So by putting those obstructions in the form of dams, they're increasing the lateral connectivity. If a flow, channel is going downstream and hits an obstacle, the water literally piles up and creates a pressure face, and it's more likely to go into the stream bed. So you get that hypereic exchange. So the beaver dams are also increasing vertical connectivity. And if you're forcing flow onto the floodplain and the water is moving slowly, some of it's going to infiltrate. So there's more vertical connectivity on the floodplain. You store a lot of surface water. This is the Fall River in Rocky Mountain National Park. Sarah, when did Sarah, what summer was that, 24? Yeah, so Sarah Rathburn, my colleague, is here. Her master's student, Sarah Dunn, did a really nice study of beaver pond sedimentation throughout our region, and I went up there with her one day, and this is at base flow. So this is the main channel on the Fall River. This is in Horseshoe Park, and it's coming over the beaver dam, but what was most interesting was trying to walk across that floodplain. This is in that grazing exclosure that they've got up there to try and keep the moose out. I don't know how many of you have heard of Atlas. He's the moose who can jump over, what is it, a 10-foot high fence? Oh, they've got him on video doing this. But despite atlas, it is a much less grazed area. There's dense willows, and since the beaver have moved in, so the Park Service put in beaver dam analogs first, but there were some beaver there, and the beaver have really been very happy with this scenario. So that whole floodplain is flooded. This is downstream. That's water just pouring off the floodplain into the active channel. The water in the main channel is low because it was base flow. So a good example of raising the water level across the floodplain, storing water in the surface, and of course, many of the riparian species like willows are pretty happy with this too. So you often get a lot of water stored in the vegetation. If you have all these obstacles and the flow is forced to go through all these paths, again, instead of me running through a clear room to that corner, I'd have to go down this way and look for aisles. Things move more slowly. So you attenuate peak flows. That means you reduce the magnitude of the floods. Instead of everything moving downstream really fast, some of it takes a different path. It ends up getting there at different times. So you're reducing the peak flow, and because you're storing water in so many areas in the surface and subsurface, gradually that water comes back into the channel, so you can increase base flow to the point where there are studies going back to the 1980s where either beaver were reintroduced, or it was usually beaver being reintroduced. They were able to bring back channels that had started going dry during the dry flow season of the year in places like Arizona and New Mexico, so even drier than here, although we were imitating Arizona until about a week ago. But, there's a lot of sediment stored in there. So, I mentioned Sarah Dunn's work. She was looking at sediment storage in these beaver ponds, and many of the sites she looked at burned in the Cameron Peak fire. As you all know, sediment came off the hill slopes after that fire. If you don't have places where it's going to get spread out across the river corridor or temporarily stored, and as a geologist, temporary could be a couple centuries at least. But if you don't store that stuff, it goes downstream fast. So this is an off-channel beaver dam on Little Beaver Creek, a tributary of the South Fork Poudre. The main channel is out of sight. It's back there. But this pond was a very good way to trap the sediment that was coming off the hill slopes in that first couple of years after Cameron Peak. And this is just a cut bank along Little Beaver. There's a lot of things stored in that stream bank. There's large wood, there's this nice organic rich sediment, and there's a lot of fine sediment. It's also a way to improve water quality, or one of the effects of beaver modification is improving water quality because you've got more of that hyperetic exchange, more nitrate uptake. You often have more stable channels. Again, if you're spreading a certain amount of water out through lots of different flow paths, it's going to be moving more slowly through each of those. It's less erosive force. So you're less likely to have catastrophic bank erosion. And lots of animals like it. These are photos from Wild Basin. This one, I said it was difficult to walk around up there. I came out of a willow thicket and they were right there. Mama's hackles went up, and that's the fastest I've ever moved at chest waves. Once I got to a safe distance, I turned around and took a photo. There's things that you don't. The only place I've ever seen a river otter in Rocky Mountain National Park was in Wild Basin. You see warblers. There's around the country there. I think biologists have studied everything from bacteria and microbes up through mammals, birds, whatever you like. You have more diversity in many cases in these beaver modified sections of the bay. You also store a lot of organic material in there, so these can be carbon sinks. As we all look for ways to sequester carbon, river corridors that are maintained in a natural state can be carbon sinks as well. And if you are going to spend some time hiking in the national forests and national parks, and you can calibrate your eyes, you'll start to see how many beaver there were. So this is downstream from Poudre Lake in Rocky Mountain National Park. If you're familiar with the area, you can hike from the Trail Ridge Road down to a place like Hague Park or the upper part of the Poudre. There's no beaver there now, but it is full of old beaver dams. So what I've outlined in the dashed line here, the white arrows, the flow directions, all beaver dam. It's completely stabilized by vegetation, but the vegetation in the pond fill is often Calamagrostis. There's a lot of indicators like this. Once you start looking there, you'll see there were beaver all over the landscape. So we know the beaver were much more abundant and their effects were much more widespread historically. And one way to think about this is what ecologists sometimes refer to as alternate states, which sounds like they're taking drugs or something, but what it means is that you could have an ecosystem. Maybe you could have this room, and it could be in two very different configurations, each of which would be stable and persistent unless something moved it into the other configuration. So one of the most common examples is beaver meadows versus elk grasslands. So on the upper half of this threshold, and the threshold is just a function of beaver being present and able to build dams. Those dams increase the ponded water upstream. They create overbank flow, so you're spreading water across the floodplain. If you follow from the bottom here clockwise, that makes the floodplain wet. So you have lakes, marshes, swamps, just floodplain wetlands. That often favors deciduous riparian species. They like having their roots wet. They're what are called obligate phreatophytes. Their roots have to get to the water table for them to survive. You have this scenario of multiple channels that branch and rejoin. All of that is really great habitat for beaver. So you get more beaver coming in. And if my hand is a multi-stemmed willow, I'm sure you've all seen these, the shrubby willows. If an elk or a moose comes along and starts browsing on that, they would be chewing on my fingertips, and my fingers would just do this and eventually disappear. There'd be nothing left at the surface, and you've probably, if you've been to Upper Beaver Meadows or Moraine Park, you know, how many willows are there? They're in the grazing exclosures, but not elsewhere otherwise. That's really intensive ungulate grazing. If a beaver comes up to that same multi-stem willow, so this is a little bit of a gory example, but it would chew off the base of my finger, and my finger would resprout. The beavers and the willows can be self-sustaining. The way beavers or beaverized willows are different than elk and moose, and the willows can resprout. So the beavers get their food and they maintain their larder too. So you have beaver food and habitat, you get more dams and ponds, and you have this very persistent effect. It's spatially extensive. It can go across the entire floodplain. It's persistent. We were doing this study in Rocky Mountain National Park, so we couldn't use motorized drilling rigs. We just used hand augers. But we got down deep enough with those to see that, and using radiocarbon dating, that beavers have been there continuously for at least 5,000 years. It's complex, so spatially heterogeneous. It's really hard to walk across, and there's a lot of different habitats, and it's very laterally and vertically connected. As long as the beaver are present, that could be the scenario in the river beds. The other side of the threshold, something causes the beaver to disappear. And it initially was commercial trapping. More recently in Rocky Mountain National Park, it's been the tremendous increase in numbers of elk and moose, and they're browsing those riparian plants to the point that the plants die back. So this is Upper Beaver Meadows. There's some sad-looking remnants of willows, and you can see that inset photo of the channel is a trench in places. It's just cut down. When the beaver aren't there, if the dams fall into disrepair, you get peak flows, they take the dams out, the peak flows. That means the flow is more likely to be concentrated in a single channel. So all that river energy is exerted in a concentrated fashion. Channel often cuts down, banks erode. The whole water table tends to go down on the floodplain. Sorry, if you're not familiar with water table, that's the height of the groundwater in the subsurface. So just think of it as the whole meadow gets drier. So now, you know, you could drop off a happily mated pair of beavers and say, be fruitful and multiply, but it's really hard to build a dam when you have a trench during peak snowmelt flows, assuming we get some peak snowmelt this year. There's nothing for them to eat in the winter. They need that woody riparian vegetation to see them through the winter. So it becomes what ecologists call an elk grassland. It's much more physically simple, and at least laterally and vertically, it tends to be disconnected. The channel is disconnected from the floodplain. And again, this can persist for a long time. And you hopefully are sitting here thinking, well, this sounds like Yellowstone. Yes, absolutely. It's the story of Yellowstone. The elk reached very high population densities. Wolves were reintroduced. It's not that they killed huge numbers of elk, but they kept the elk moving. Elk and moose are just like cows. Left to their own devices, they will just hang out in the riparian zone. It's cool, it's wet, there's all this nice grass, not grass, there's all this nice vegetation to eat. But if you have top predators, they keep the ungulates moving and give the riparian vegetation a chance to recover. So before we all leave tonight, everybody has to cross their fingers and say, wolves come, let's go. Because they're not going to be reintroduced to Rocky Mountain. If they get there on their own, they have a lot to eat. So on the upper part of this if you've got beaver modifying the river corridor, it's resilient to a lot of disturbances. You have a lot of nutrients being biologically taken up. There's carbon storage, there's greater biodiversity. So what's not to like? Well, people are still trapping beaver and removing them as nuisances or hazards for a lot of reasons. I mean, the beavers dam anything they think will increase the water level. And there's this idea that beavers inherently need to stop running water. The sound of running water triggers them to shut the dam. That's a little controversial because there's always water going over the top of and through a dam. The reason beavers build dams is that the entrance to their burrows or their dens is below the water surface. That's to keep predators, to deter predators from coming in. So if you have beavers in the middle of a pond or lake, they won't build a dam. They'll just build a lodge out in the center if the water's shallow enough. So they dam rivers to increase flow depth. And if there's a culvert or an intake or some other infrastructure where they might be able to build a lodge, they'll dam that too. So people will remove them to keep them from damming those structures. Of course, if the pond gets big enough, it can submerge property, structures, so people don't like that. The part of Wild Basin that's just downstream from the park boundary, in the past, the owners of that lodge, which I've forgotten the name of, but it's when you go in the access road to Wild Basin, they would kill the beavers because the beavers were chewing down the aspens, and it's an event place for weddings and things, and they don't want a bunch of aspen stumps. So sometimes people don't want their riparian trees destroyed. In some cases, when the beaver flood an area that's never been flooded before, as the vegetation that's now inundated decays, it does produce methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. This is a concern in Alaska as beavers are moving north as it gets warmer. So they're going farther into the Arctic. So there are hazards that are created. On the other side, there's all the things I've been talking about. You have this more laterally and vertically connected river corridor, got water storage in the surface and subsurface. You attenuate those peak flows, you increase base flows during dry periods. That dense woody riparian vegetation creates frictional resistance to water moving downstream, particularly at high flows, so you can attenuate those flood peaks, store a lot of materials. Because there's increased nitrate uptake, you can improve water quality. The channels are more stable. There's habitat and diversity and carbon storage. So the things I've been talking about. And there are national level guidebooks that are online. This is the first edition. There's a second edition now, the Beaver Restoration Guidebook, that's got a lot of detail on all sorts of things, including how to live with beaver and also how to reintroduce beaver. There are also tools that allow us to get some idea of how many beaver either were present historically in a particular area or could be supported today. And this is a great acronym. It's the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool, or BRAT. It was developed by colleagues at Utah State. This doesn't estimate beaver population, but it estimates the number of dams per length of channel, and then you can make some guesses about the population density. So a few years ago, one of my grad students ran this for the state of Colorado, and there's no way you're going to be able to see any of the details in the back, but you can see red, hopefully, and the red is places where there's no potential to support beavers. And if you look at it, it's the big rivers, the Arkansas, the South Platte. There were probably, almost certainly, absolutely, never beavers in the main stem there. They're too big. So, you can discount all the major rivers, but then the areas that have different colors, there's progressively greater number of beavers that could be there, or beaver dams. So this is the decrease from, we looked at data sets of things like land cover or vegetation that would allow us to estimate this beaver dam density prior to European settlement of Colorado versus today. And the red areas are the big change. So there's been an immense loss. Before Julie Scamardo did this work, before she did this, I came across this hand-drawn map from the 1950s that showed large beaver complexes in Colorado. And I got on Google Earth to look at them to see what was still there. And within about half an hour, I was writing little profanities in the margin because it's like, oh, right, now it's a big golf course outside of Dillon Reservoir, or right, there were very few of them left. So for a variety of reasons, we've lost it. But where beaver can be introduced or reintroduced, there's pretty low-tech, cheap ways to live with them. So these are examples of these very simple structures, and hopefully you can see that's a culvert or an irrigation intake. You fence them off. Probably have some frustrated beavers, but they can't dam it up. There are things called beaver pond levelers. It's just a big flexible PVC type tube that you put through the dam at a level where you don't want the water to go above that tube, and you put a fence at either end in the water. So it's a drain. And the beavers learn to live with that. Or if you have valuable riparian trees, put some fences up. Or people do things like paint them with non-toxic paint with sand mixed in, so the beavers can't chew them. It's more an attitude thing rather than, oh, we've got a problem, we've got to kill the beavers. If you're willing to spend a little more time and effort and then maybe be more tolerant and creative, there's a lot of ways to deal with beavers. And of course, there's now a lot of efforts to imitate beavers. And I just love the idea of the beavers looking at some of these, but so much better. So ideally, they'll come and build on top. So I wasn't trying to because Campbell Creek is WRV. So they put in some beaver dam analogs here. This was one of the places Julie Scamardo worked for her master's. There were some on different parts of Fish Creek, including the Chaley Ranch. And these are, I have to say, the most convincing. They used beaver chewed wood because there are beavers present there. And we went up to look at these and put some instrumentation in. And this was a case where the beavers definitely said, oh, we could so fix that. So a week later, we came back and it looked like this. And there's a reason we say busy beavers and all the expressions we had. They were reintroduced in the Dale Creek watershed, which is a tributary of the North Fork Poudre. And in the first summer, 2 beavers built 21 dams in about a mile of channel. And, the channel is not super wide, but it was still very impressive. So they can do a lot, and maybe the beaver dam analogs may be a good place for them to start. They can also be in places that you might not expect. So this is the Rocky River way out on the Colorado-Nebraska border. It's the Nature Conservancy's Fox Ranch, and that's an upper view on Google Earth. This is a place that's had a tough history. It's had a lot of groundwater pumping, so the river has become more and more intermittent. It doesn't have surface flow. It was always naturally intermittent, but it's become more so because there's less flow in the river. But when I was there last time, that's a beaver berm. There's big cottonwoods in the back, but mostly they're using willows that are maximum diameter like that. But there's a lot of shrubby willows that they can use. And in February, it looks like nothing in this photo, but I went in there with chest waders and overtopped them, which was not fun, cold. But this low gradient river in the short grass steppe, where you might not expect beaver, they're there, and nobody introduced them. They just managed to persist here. So going back to the title slide, which is Hay Creek in Rocky Mountain National Park, the big question is, if we're going to restore beats, and this is exactly what CPRW and WRV and others are doing, how many beats do we need to restore to see whatever we want to see? More nitrate uptake, more base flow, more peak flow attenuation, and where in the network? So a very idealized representation of beads. This is a generic stream network. Each of the light blue blobs is a bead. This is probably what it looks like historically. These are spaced fairly regularly down the length of streams. And we haven't changed valley geometry. We haven't gotten rid of the beads. What we've done is constrain the ability of flow in the channel to interact with that floodplain through flow regulation, through bank stabilization, through levees, etc. So now it looks something more like this. There's a few beads left. But the question is, what are we going to go to in future? And I put a box on this one because the preliminary results suggest that if you can slow things down in the headwaters, that's the best way to do it for a couple of reasons. One, the headwaters around here are mostly going to be federal land. And even with the current administration, there's more access to that for restoration. So national forest, national park. Two, it seems to me like kind of common sense if you can slow people getting on to I-25 with those 1 car per green light rather than just letting everybody get into the interstate at the same time. you have a better chance of trying to reduce flood peaks and create some of these beneficial effects. So other open questions, you know, if we want some of these functions back, like peak flow attenuation, base flow, what exactly do we have to do? It's not a one size fits all. What is it that maintains functionality? How much functionality is necessary? And I see this as a really nice opportunity for people in the research and the practitioner and the non-governmental spaces to interact and to have partnerships. So I know a lot of my colleagues at CSU are working, well, I'll pick on Sarah because I know her well. She's working with the Park Service. They're monitoring some of the things that are going on in the Kawanichi. Other colleagues in civil engineering are working with, and in fisheries are working with CPRW. What is the effect of these structures? We're not going to ever be able to do things better if we don't look at what's happening based on what we do now. So monitoring is a key part of all this. Now, and there's an awful lot of books about rivers. I mean, those two, but there's an awful lot of books about beavers. So the most recent one I'm aware of is Beaverland. Lily Pond is, of all these, my favorite. If you haven't, I'm not even sure it's in print anymore. I think you can, yeah, you can probably buy used copies. It was written in the late 80s, but Hope Ryden, I don't even know if she's alive anymore. I can't find much online, but she was a biologist who spent 4 years observing a beaver colony in upstate New York. And that's the one that really got me enthusiastic about beavers beyond seeing what they do in riverscapes. They're pretty fascinating animals, and they very much have learned behaviors. They have individual personalities. So I think this is not my photo. I wish it was, but I'll end with a National Geographic photo of the beaver at the Tetons, and happy to take questions. Yes.
I was working with WRV on the ranch up in Red Feather Lakes doing wildfire mitigation work. And Elkhorn Creek flows through there. And I was told, this is anecdotal, that people who manage Elkhorn Creek had removed beaver dams because they wanted to increase water flow. Does that make any sense? Probably not, but
no.
Do you think
but it's not uncommon.
Okay.
The idea is, you know, you see this ponded water and you say, oh, it's evaporating, it's being taken up by plants and transpired. We want it to go downstream. But what has been shown in more than one study is you get the peak flow coming through faster, but you have lower base flow. So you have less even distribution of flow throughout the year. Another book from the so this is not new. There's a book I read that was published in the 1950s. I don't like the title, but it's Three Against the Wilderness. It's actually a delightful book. This family decided to homestead in, I can't remember if it was BC or Alberta, but the ranchers were all upset because their creek had gone dry and it never used to dry up. And this family, on their land, they allowed the beavers to come back and the creek became perennial again. So it's not a scientific study, but there are scientific studies that show that you can restore more even flow throughout the year. And if you're not aware of it, it was just, I think it was a year ago. I think Jackie Corday is speaking later in this series, so she'll be able to tell you a lot more about this. But she was instrumental in getting the state legislature to pass a bill that now makes it feasible to restore beavers without worrying so much about prior appropriations and downstream water rights. Yes.
How many beavers are introduced in Colorado compared to that are trapped?
No idea. I really, I have no idea. I'm trying to think. Yeah, so is that commercial trapping for fur or is that nuisance? I mean, do you have to report it if you're... Okay. Okay. What is trapped? Do you have any idea how many are reintroduced? Or I don't. Yeah, sorry, I don't know. There's not. This may be changing, but I don't think there's been that much regulation in the past about just reintroducing beaver on your land if you want to. So I don't think there's very good record keeping of this as part of that. Maybe there's one back here. Yeah.
Don't have,
I don't know. I don't think Colorado's ever banned beaver trapping. Most states haven't.
Bill says in drop right now in inflation, looking for state beaver. With some exceptions, but it's in right now.
And it's not just deep, so they call it further settlements. Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. What?
You can find it.
Does beaver restoration require maintenance, and how often is that maintenance? If create a beaver.
So my students say my most common response is it depends. But there's so much that's context dependent. So sometimes, yes, it can be self-sustaining. Sometimes it requires maintenance. A lot of it depends on how much freedom you have. There are places where beads are being restored in urban areas. So you've got a very narrow bead that you're working with, and there's no, let's say you put in engineered log jam, and there's no way for wood to keep coming in naturally. Then you may have to do something. Or you put in a beaver dam analog. One of the ones I showed in Fish Creek is right by I think it's called the Fish Creek Road, that neighborhood at the south end of Estes. Again, there's beaver aren't going to live there. There's no trees. So if you want to keep that structure, you have to maintain it. Other places you may be able to just jumpstart the system and then step back and let it work on its own. That's more likely in some of the more natural areas. And the best scenario, at least for beavers, is build a beaver dam analog and then real beavers come in.
You mentioned about exposures. Do you,
No, I know they can come back pretty quickly, just based on what I've seen. I've lived here since 1989, so I've seen them put more and more exposures in. So it can happen within a decade, but I don't know. They haven't taken any exposures down, so I don't know if they were to remove those fences, if the ungulates would just say, "Ha, smorgasbord," and that was the end of them. I'm not sure how big a willow has to be before it's ungulate proof or ungulate resistant. Sorry, I think yeah.
We'll get research or
Sarah, I'll let Sarah talk. I don't have, I mean, yes, I always have research and I have grad students, but I don't have anybody coming up who's going to be working on beaver related things. We're looking more at some of the functionality of these beads in general and at large wood. But Sarah, do you want to talk about Itai's work?
That's been fun. Flow, sample, and doing some tracer tests to understand and how much water is moving for that modeling and the design.
I'll just add one thing to that with the modeling. We have a colleague, Ryan Morrison, in the civil engineering department, current PhD student, Nick Christensen, who's just starting to do two-dimensional modeling. So hydraulic modeling, simply water goes downstream. You keep adding the 3 dimensions, it gets more and more complex. But now 2 dimensions, so downstream and across the valley, is becoming more common. And Nick's been modeling some of these structures. And as that modeling takes off, CPRW could look at a bead and say, how many BDAs do we need to put in here to create the flood attenuation that we want? So it's really exciting to have this partnership between measuring some of what's actually happening at some of the implementation sites and then trying to numerically simulate it.
All in the Comanche Valley, they are saying that the looking to get to be 5 feet. So that's the height
That's
of
very
the browsing would actually.
Well, they could probably do that in 5 years. Or is it longer? Oh, interesting. Perfect. Yep.
Science, do that.
I'm going to give that some thought. Not that I know of off the top of my head. There are other citizens. Oh, yeah. Perfect. The other thing I'd add, it's not necessarily related to beavers, but there's the flow tracker network, which involves people taking photos of channels and just recording some simple data on their phone. And that's to try and figure out which channels dry up during certain times of the year and how that might change through time as it gets warmer and drier and drier. You know what's going to happen here in the future. So I think it's just called the flow tracker network, isn't it? Stream tracker. Thank you. Okay. I guess.
Sorry, it's for landscape parks that
Fish like beads. Fish like functional beads. No, if you have that diversity of flow paths, so you've got secondary channels, you've got main channel, you've got ponded water, you've got periodic overbank flow, that's habitat diversity for fish. It's places where they can find refugia during extreme events like post-fire floods and debris flows. It's an awful lot of fish food being manufactured, whether that fish food is the, should I call it, periphyton is a technical term, the green scum on the rocks, or aquatic insects or terrestrial insects. Yep. So having fully functional beads is really good for a lot of fish. Yep.
Special, that's.
Yeah, I'll just say, not to cast aspersions on any discipline, but still in some states today, but until the 80s, there were a lot of fish biologists who felt they had to remove beaver dams to enhance fish passage, and there've been a lot of studies that show that the fish do just fine with the beaver dams. Thank you. It's partly because in a river beat scenario, there's often another way. I mean, the beaver dams are not Grand Coulee, they're not giant. So a lot of fish can go over them in both directions. There are some life stages and some species that can't, but there's often another way to get around.
We talked a lot about the beaver dams, the wood and the stream, but if you study large wood that hurts foul and block dams, can you talk briefly about that, the role that plays? Or have similar?
Briefly, no. Yeah, so I think these as being analogs. So if you are in an area that's got dense conifer forest, that doesn't support that many willows, and beaver don't like conifer. Eating them. That's not great beaver habitat, but those big conifers fall in and create a lot of log jams. So the log jams have many of the same functions physically as beaver dams, and biologically and biogeochemically. There's no living organism maintaining them, but we have a lot of disturbances and we have blowdowns, we have fires, we have insect infestations, we have the occasional debris flow and landslide. So wood keeps coming into the channels. So I did an 11-year study of every logjam that spanned the channel in the North St. Vrain catchment in Rocky Mountain National Park was about 300 logjams. And what we found was that individual logjams come and go. They only, even really big ones, may only last 3 or 4 years. But if there's something in the channel configuration or the river corridor that causes a logjam to form, even if one goes during a peak flow, another one will form there. So you can have steady state conditions where individual logjams are moving, but the logjams are present, as long as you have the recruitment source. If all the trees go away, then there's going to be a period when recruitment here refers to wood falling into the channels. So one of the things that was most interesting about another study we did in Rocky Mountain, we compared younger managed forests. So this forest was at least a century old, but it had a history of timber harvest and wood removal. Younger unmanaged forests, so it was a century or so, but because of natural disturbances like wildfires, blowdowns, and old growth unmanaged, so that the forest is at least 200 years old. I knew the old growth was different. It was going to have a lot more log jams, a lot more wood, but I thought that the two younger ones would be the same. They were not. The younger managed had less wood, fewer pools, less log jams, lower trap biomass, lower macroinvertebrates. So other studies have been done in other parts of the world. It takes something like 200 years to recover to a natural level of wood load once you remove the trees and the wood. So again, you can jumpstart that with engineered log jams or artificially reintroducing wood, but unlike putting beaver in, the wood is not consciously manipulating things. So if you put the wood in and it goes away, you have to put more wood in if you're waiting for the trees to regrow. But I do think of the physical effects as being very similar between the two. In both cases, it's an obstruction in the flow, either it's a beaver dam or a log jam.
Beaver dams probably help. Like fireflies, it's a great environment for fireflies. And I also wanted to mention a perfect example of a man-made beaver dam is Cherry Creek State Park.
Ah, okay.
During 2013, that reservoir rose 10 feet to catch all that water. And probably was beaver dams 200 years ago.
Yeah, many of the areas that are reservoirs now were probably...
That valley down there is peppered little lakes.
Yes.
So, in parts of the world where beaver aren't the native species, how do the rivers function? Do they have this similar bead and string structure?
Yeah, beads and strings seem to be fairly ubiquitous in any place that has some topographic relief. They're not as common in the plains, but hilly to mountainous terrain. There are other things that can create this multiple channels branching and rejoining. If you have naturally occurring debris flows or landslides, you bring in a lot of sediment, or snow avalanches, it brings in a lot of sediment and logs. That's an obstruction that creates a multi-thread channel. So there's different processes that create that. And I was very lucky. A couple of years ago, I took a vacation in the Okavango Delta, and that was fascinating for a lot of reasons. I mentioned hippos because hippos are ecosystem engineers in that system. They're like cows that are really, really, really big. They all follow each other. So they create these compacted trails across the floodplain that then become secondary channels. And we watched elephants taking mud baths, which was quite an experience. They create these big wallows that are 6 feet deep, and that becomes a channel during the next flood season. So there are other ecosystem engineers. The other ones in the Okavango are termites, but that really would be a longer story. So there are other processes that can create the spatial heterogeneity beyond beavers. That was a good set of questions. Yeah.
So you showed a map of lots of beads historically. Last example, did you say that we're up to getting more beads back, or still on beads?
It depends. It depends where you are in the world. I said we don't have such good beads down here, but we're still losing stream services down here as we get more and more people in Colorado. I think we've reached the nadir and we're climbing out of it in the mountains. Other parts of the country, yeah, depending on what's going on with land development and population increase. So it is very context dependent. I think we're definitely on the upswing in areas that had the 2020 fires, though. There's a very clear rationale for restoring some of that functionality and a lot of impetus to do that.
What would you say is the lifeguard's cost for us to make better as just here?
Water availability. I mean, well, yeah, that's part of it. Water availability may be the biggest constraint. We don't have as much water as we used to, even if we didn't have all the diversions, and we do have all the diversions. Yeah. Well, I mean, so it's about 3 weeks ago now. I was down at Arapahoe Bends with the consultants, the restoration project there, and their big concern is trying to miniaturize the Poudre because they don't expect to get the peak flows to completely reoccupy the floodplain, and they don't want to make it too big so that they get a lot of fine sediment accumulated there. So thinking about how to shrink the river corridor, even though they have the space, because they don't expect to have the water. So I think in Colorado, that's one of the biggest rates. Assuming, if you're in the middle of an urban area, then that's the obvious constraint. But even in the mountains, I think the water availability is a big one.
What does it take to relocate a beaver? And you have a nuisance beaver that gets trapped somewhere, you can't just go dump it in the national forest or sort of the little Detroit environment.
Yeah. I think you are supposed to get permission from Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I don't know how hard that is to do. When you said what does it take, there's two aspects. One is what might it take legally, but the other is what might it take if you expect the poor animal to survive the experience. So thinking about the time of year, if it's a place that already has beaver, they're territorial. They don't kill each other, but that newcomer is not going to be welcome and may have a hard time. Winter is a time of high mortality for a lot of animals, including beavers, so you don't want to drop them off in the fall. So there's let's say the legal considerations, and then there's the practical considerations of having the animals survive. And even people who know what they're doing, I think it's improving, but if you look at that beaver restoration guidebook, they talk about half the animals dying, even though it's done as carefully as possible. Oh, yeah. Oh, perfect.
They that struggle to take root where you place them. Beyond they can't. Because they get spurt. And then you
Yeah, thank you. Did you have a?
Pretty territorial.
Yeah.
Like most things in territorial, we help to. And disease, somebody mentioned quarantine with all animal pot, whenever you relocate, you have to. I don't know what kind of diseases they carry, but.
Well, I guess it sounds like they can carry whirling disease in their fur. I know they can die from tularemia. I don't know if they're.
There's exotics like stiff, like snail,
yeah.
larva.
They can transport those inadvertently.
The basic plants that
So when we get involved, they.
Yes, they do. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. That was a great question. Yeah.